I have the pleasure of not having to game with an IGP in my main computer for a very long time. For the generally tech savvy of you, IGP means integrated graphics processor, these days meaning on the CPU itself. But up to a few years ago, IGP meant a GPU that would be on the motherboard directly and almost always never having any kind of form of dedicated VRAM. Despite a major push by both AMD and Intel in boosting the graphics performance of IGPs, in general they still just really suck. But it still doesn't take away from the fact that a lot of computers are stuck with them, especially laptops. The subject of today's video is I'm going to test out the Intel HD 4600 graphics within my i5 4690K CPU in my main computer. I've never really taken the time to see just how good, or well, how not bad they are when it comes to gaming, as I've only used the IGP in this machine twice until just recently. Because when I first built this computer a couple years ago, I already had a graphics card and I was using it from the get-go. So I've never had to use the IGP for anything. Going by what I can find on Intel's website and Wikipedia, as well as some other sources, the HD 4600 graphics do contain 20 execution units and can clock up to 1.35 GHz depending on the CPU model. Now in this i5 4690K, officially according to Intel, it clocks up to 1.2 GHz at max boost. At that frequency, we're looking at about around 400 GFLOPS of compute power. To put it very mildly, this is not a lot of graphics horsepower for modern gaming. Now versus old consoles like the 360 and PS3, this is actually quite a bit more than they could both either achieve when it comes to graphics performance. However, since this is an IGP, it means sharing its memory bandwidth with the CPU. By that token alone, it does not bode well for this IGP. However, that's not going to stop us from testing this HD 4600 and how it runs a few modern games. Let's jump right into our first title, which we're already playing here, Grand Theft Auto V. Despite being optimized for a very broad range of hardware, unfortunately the HD 4600 does not run Grand Theft Auto V all that great. Right now we're running at 720p with everything down at their minimum settings, with the exception of population density and variety, as well as distance scaling. Despite such low settings, we're often dipping down below 30 frames per second, which is not all that great, but at the same time, it's hard for me to say you cannot play this game on an HD 4600 if that's what you're stuck with. Despite the past gen visuals, the heavy aliasing, and the sometimes crappy performance, this game is still worth playing even on an HD 4600, but of course it's that much better with an actual graphics card. As far as performance goes, yes, they're going to be around 30 FPS at the very maximum. There are going to be some times where it's going to be much higher, but there's also going to be even more times where it is below 30 FPS. But once again, I'm going to reiterate, this is a game worth playing. Even at these crappy graphics settings, it's still plenty of fun. Moving on, the newest game in the suite of tests is going to be Overwatch. This game, just like Grand Theft Auto V, we are running at completely minimal settings at 720p. Our resolution scaling is at 100%, so it is a true 720p image. Luckily, Overwatch's art style does hold up at 720p and even with minimal graphics settings. Unfortunately, some things are just absolutely fugly, and we are missing out on some effects like shadows in order to play this game on the 4600 at minimal settings, but with decent frame rate. Performance does sit around 30 FPS bare minimum in many areas, and it often goes up, but just really depends on how much action is going on screen at once. Overwatch is just another great example of Blizzard's historical practice of really well optimizing their games across a very large and broad range of hardware. By that token, I'm not really surprised at the performance we're getting. However, I did honestly expect the game to be able to look a little better than this at minimum settings while still running at our same kind of FPS that we're seeing right now. At least 2.5 years old, the HD 4600 IGP really is hitting the end of its rope in terms of its useful life. Luckily, I can't say the same thing about the actual CPUs in the i5 4690K processor, which as far as I can foresee still has plenty of years of useful life in it, especially as long as the current console generation continues. But we're not talking about the CPU cores in the i5 4690K. Let's reiterate the fact that we are talking about the HD 4600 IGP, and therefore let's move on to our next game. Few games are as FPS dependent as Counter-Strike Global Offensive. Considering it came out in 2012, the HD 4600 gets a nice little break here, as it can run this game at 1080p, all low settings, and still get almost 60 FPS all the time. I guess we can really thank the fact that this game is really rooted in the past generation of consoles as well as older PC hardware before the current console generation came out. That just means relatively crappy hardware, including IGPs, can enjoy this game with good performance and decent visuals. If you're willing to tank your frame rate, you can increase the visuals in many certain settings. However, I would still recommend low settings in 1080p to get as much detail on screen as possible when trying to make those long-range shots. Any increases in graphical detail should be reciprocated in a decrease in screen resolution. For those who are frame rate sensitive, a drop down to 720p from 1080p will at least double your frame rate in many cases. That being said, CSGO runs very comfortably on the HD 4600, provided you don't push anything too far. Next we have an online FPS shooter that absolutely eats the HD 4600 for lunch. This is Battlefield 4. As with GTA 5 and Overwatch, this is another game that we have to run at 720p, pretty much minimum settings in order to get a decent frame rate at any moment. And plenty of the time, it is not even hitting 30. However, unlike CSGO, this game is fairly comfortable to play at around 30 FPS. You don't need the very high frame rate in order to enjoy it. However, with that said, this is really a game that you want to play with a graphics card, regardless of settings you play it at, and regardless of resolution. And to be perfectly honest, I was kind of surprised that we weren't able to get above 30 FPS, at least as an average frame rate, considering this game did come out on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. To reiterate how powerful the HD 4600 is, at its max boost clock, it can actually achieve around 400 gigaflops of graphics processing compute. The PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 3, well actually the Xbox 360 specifically, hits 240 max. However, once again, it really comes down to the fact that this HD 4600 is sharing memory bandwidth with its CPU cores. The memory bandwidth that is available to it really is just not enough to make full use of the graphics processor when it comes to gaming, especially when you have all these textures on screen, playing at decent resolutions, and with all these other effects as well. And by that token, faster RAM in your computer can actually help quite a bit in smoothing out the performance of the HD 4600. However, your money and time is just much better spent on an actual graphics card. If you're on a laptop, however, you are just plain stuck. Let's move on. The last game I want to show is Tomb Raider 2013. Much like Counter-Strike Go, there is some room to improve some of the graphics settings. However, for a decent frame rate across the entire board of gameplay, it's generally just best to stick at 720p and mostly minimal settings. Funny enough, when I was making this short little gameplay test, I accidentally left motion blur on, and motion blur is one of the biggest offenders when it comes to bandwidth requirements. Along with that, I did have the textures and shadow map resolution set to normal settings, which graphically makes the game akin to the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions. However, those versions of this game probably do feature FXAA as well as a few other effects that are missing right now. Luckily, the HD 4600 at least gives us a serviceable experience in Tomb Raider 2013 like it does with GTA 5, Overwatch, and Counter-Strike Go. However, with this being the last test, I think it really does help to exemplify the fact the Intel HD 4600 IGP really is just a bare bones graphics processor for playing games on. For only $110 MSRP, you can go out and get an NVIDIA GTX 1050 that absolutely blows this thing completely out of the water. All the games that you've seen today on this video, you can run pretty much at max settings, 1080p, and playable frame rates, in some cases even 60 FPS. Well, this is the end of this video. My name is Blitz. I hope you enjoyed this. Make sure to give the video a like if you did. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for more stuff like you've seen today, and to remember the fact that, in general, IGPs are turds. Y'all have a good one.